Okay, we're live. Hello, beautiful young people and old out there alike.
You
We
call me
already,
old?
huh?
Did you call me old?
I mean, you know,
I just got a haircut and see all my gray hairs. I finally got my post pandemic haircut. It's about time, you know.
mm,
You know.
the nice the nice Hal Jordan wingtip thing
That's
going
right.
on.
This is the Hal Jordan before that this is evidence of the parallax infection because I got the white hair. Yeah, that's the parallax infection. So I'm riddled with fear right now. And since we're talking about the comic book industry, I'm in the perfect mood to talk about it because I'm
Oh,
riddled with
baby,
fear. Good
what
grief!
a time! What a time to be alive.
Woohoo!
We got a couple of gents joining us in the chat. Damian Wayne, who may in fact be my favorite Robin. This will be something I'm interested in your take, DK. And yeah, I mean, I'm not interested in my take because I live with it, but hopefully somebody else is, or else there would be no point. Aaron Vio saying, hey, how's everyone doing tonight? I'm doing okay. Admittedly sleepy. Got myself a coffee. I don't know. I know. Boom just got done doing some outdoor grilling. So
That's right. Yeah, I did some barbecuing, drank the Corona. I've actually been sick the last couple days, and I don't really know why. I don't. It's the oddest thing. I was dizzy and had a little bit of a fever, and I don't think it was. I don't think it was COVID. It was just, but it was something I had. A little bit. My balance was off, and I was feeling under the weather. Just the oddest thing. I don't know. Must have been something I read. But I didn't read anything by Bendis, so I don't know what it is. But I did read Legion. Maybe that's what it is.
you did read what?
I reviewed Legion of Superheroes #7. I think maybe that's what did it.
Oh, that's the mistake. That's
Maybe
probably why
did.
that's probably why I'm still drained, man. Because I put out my review of Death Metal #2, and dude, I'm more tired than a motherfucker. So that I think we've come down to our problems here, my friend.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. We got Tehillim29 says, and good to see you all. It's good to see you too, buddy. Thanks for joining. I think with all that out of the way, it'd be about time to give the illustrious intro to the show. So let's pop that out. Hey guys, welcome to the 51st. That's right. We made it beyond the 50 episode mark. Episode of Lex Talk Comics, where myself and another co-host in the comic book community discuss one of the many facets of the storytelling medium that is comics, whether it be stories, creators, constructs, or adaptations. We hit it all this week. Of course, I am joined by the comic book Canadian Cape Crusader himself, my friend, I would say one of your top 10 favorite comic book YouTubers out there on the internet space. Comic Boom. What's going on, my brother?
Oh man, well, thank you for that illustrious, once again, illustrious introduction. I'm doing fine. Like I said, I'm doing better now, and just pumped out a Wonder Woman review in the last little bit. Mariko Tamaki's premiere issue with Maxwell Lord, and we've had a rather interesting comic book industry, some controversies as of late, and I'm looking forward to ranting and raving. Well, mostly ranting about it with you.
Yeah, there's definitely going to be a little bit of both. Before we get into the main topic, Aaron Vio says, dude, that review of Death Metal 2 hurt my soul. I had such high hopes. I'm sorry, my friend. I call spades, brother. I can't not do that. So I'm glad you watched it. Thank you for watching it, and I appreciate you. So with that out of the way, let's get into the topic today. We're kind of discussing this social media crisis on, one Earth, as far as we know of. When it comes to comic books and their social media presence, the creators, the industry, the fans, I feel like it's been quite tumultuous pretty much since I've kind of even walked into comic book social media. I've been reading comics. What am I? I'm 23. So probably for 6-ish years, 7 tops. And I don't think I really joined the online space until about 3-4 years ago. And I would say even from then on, the comic book online space can either be your favorite thing on the internet or your absolute least favorite thing on the internet. So it's an oddity. And I know, Boom, obviously you've seen comic books back when it was all about, the forum pages and all of those shenanigans. And obviously you're seeing it now. So what is your sort of relationship with comic book social media?
I've got I learned the hard way. I remember the first time I learned the hard way with social media, and I think a lot of creators and a lot of especially young creators learn the hard way too when they first start getting involved in social media. Now they most are involved at a younger and younger age all the time, but I remember making my first mistakes of shooting my mouth off too much on social media, not realizing the backlash you'd get. I remember on DC comic message boards back in the early 2000s. I remember, boy, I got reprimanded if I had the wrong opinion. You learn very quickly what to say and what not to say, and when to keep your mouth shut when you don't know what you're talking about. And guess what? I still make that mistake. I still talk about stuff I don't know much. And it's let's face it, we've all made mistakes. And we're all going to continue to make mistakes. And one thing about social media is that when you make a mistake, there's usually about 10 million to whatever, 400 billion people. I don't know. What is it with the population of the planet? Anybody with a cell phone or an iPhone or an Android can tell you what they think of your opinion. And you got to really watch what you say. We live in a micro-aggressive time. Everybody's offended by everybody. We live in ultra-sensitive political times. We got Comicsgate versus SJWism. I don't even know. There's people define Comicsgate differently. People define SJW differently. They can't even agree on definitions. So if I say I'm Comicsgate or you're, which I can't say I am because I don't know what it is. I don't know how you're defining it. Obviously, if you define comics book as a hate group, which, well, who the hell's going to admit they're part of a hate group, right? Obviously, most people who are in Comicsgate say it's not a hate group. SJWs. Hitler was a social justice warrior. So are you a fascist because you're an SJW? Where do you draw the line? This is the nonsense of the whole debate. People redefine the terms and then they argue, and then we end up with what happened in this last few months where it's come to a head. And I'll let you segue into that.
Well, I mean, we've really been seeing a lot of this the last couple of years with the introduction of, I would say a comparably more right-wing group of comic book fans that are kind of frustrated with the politics sometimes involved within the comic book industry, which is largely headed by folks of the left wing. Personally, I see problems very much on both sides, as I tend to do in most things, but it's certainly come to a head at the hand of veteran comic book artist Ethan Van Sciver. You might know him from many works on Green Lantern with Jeff Johns, his work on Impulse. He did some work on the X-Men, a number of things, mostly renowned for his Green Lantern work. I hadn't known this prior, but I guess, a decade plus ago, he actually ran into a little bit of trouble kind of spouting off about his political beliefs and whatnot. But it really came to a head just after DC Rebirth launched. He split himself from DC Comics, or vice versa. Who knows? Nobody's come out and been explicit about that. And he's kind of been unrestrained in the way that he carries himself, and at times can be fairly bigoted. I would certainly say, but it's definitely created this comic book culture war that I think you'll see Boom occasionally bring up on these live streams in passing. And it's, man, when I described this conversation or the topic of this conversation, when I say tumultuous, I mean tumultuous. You are either good or evil, black or white, and it goes for both sides. They're looking at it through these very narrow lenses, and I think both sides, as people do also in political spaces and whatnot, tend to forget that the right answer 99 times out of 100 will be somewhere in the middle. But I don't know, because I didn't see this kind of big comic book culture war coming, right? Because when I got into like interacting with comic book fans online, I was really fresh to it all. When did you start to notice this shift?
Well, the shift, I think it's fair to say that it started with Gamergate. Now, I don't think neither one of us here are experts on the specific origins of even Gamergate or Comicsgate, but it started with Gamergate, with the idea that, women were being women who played video games with men, with boys, felt they were being discriminated against in the gaming industry, even when they were playing the live games, and apparently were being insulted, and it started there. And then you got into the whole Zoe Quinn was part of that, and she eventually became a comic book writer, wrote a series for Vertigo that was somewhat badly received. But in any event, Gamergate started it, and then it delved, and that was in around 2000. I'm guessing around 2011, 2012. I remember, for me, the big thing was around 2015, and especially the year 2017. Marvel Comics. I remember in 2017. Out of the 12 months in 2017, Marvel Comics had a PR disaster every month because they went on a diversity kick, and it coincided with, coincidentally, depending on which camp you believe, with them changing their main stars. They changed their classic heroes were replaced. Tony Stark, you had Riri Williams. For Thor, you had Jane Foster Thor, and Captain Marvel with Carol Danvers, and you had with Hawkeye, you had female Hawkeye, and there was a next generation of legacy heroes, which nobody was against the legacy heroes. However, because Marvel tended to do it, and even Mark Waid admits this, that Marvel did it all at once. They didn't do it piecemeal. And so because they changed and they impacted their major classic hero line all at once, there was a perception that the diversity was being forced. And that created a huge controversy. And if you got upset because it wasn't your Odinson Thor, you possibly faced an accusation on Twitter or on social media that you were racist or you're a chauvinist. And it sort of built from there. And then when you factor in personalities like Ethan Van Sciver, and I remember, even friends, when I first came in, Captain Cummings originally was a well-known personality, still is. He actually coined the term Comicsgate. He was the founder of Comicsgate, and I believe he's since left it. And then Ethan Van Sciver sort of took it over, and then there was that another character. Diversity in Comics was his name. He every time he'd review a comic book, he'd tear it up. He'd review a Marvel comic book online, and he'd literally tear it up when he was done reviewing it. And he'd get hundreds of thousands of views every time he would do that. And the fact of the matter is that it caused a huge controversy. And that was just a microcosm of the larger cultural, political landscape that we have right now. The larger cultural landscape, I think, has gotten worse because you look at the political landscape around right now in the United States and the world. And then, of course, comic books, I think it's still there in comic books in the form of Comicsgate versus SJWism. So that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, I agree. And you summarized it perfectly. And if I might give to those of you who are not super in tune with this comic book culture war, I will give you the most, I would say, distilled criticisms of either side, right? Because I feel personally like I don't fall within either side. So I do feel like I can give an unbiased sort of understanding of what each side, or the problems that each side has with one another. So I would say if you were to distill Comicsgate down to the worst thing, they're labeled as hate mongers. They are labeled as misogynists. They are labeled as sort of hyper aggressive, right? And I think that hyper aggression kind of stems from problems that they've found within their opposition, right? If you were to go into the SJW camp of sorts, the biggest complaints I would say are their weaponization of virtue signaling, their gatekeeping, and I would say the mob mentality isms of hyper progressivism. And Boom, feel free to interrupt me if you think I'm not sort of, laying down the criticisms of either side. Is there anything that you would add to sort of the criticisms of either Comicsgate or the SJWs?
Well, this is such a dangerous topic because, I mean, even before we went on the air, I sort of ranted on you a little bit. And I literally, I mean, take Ethan Van Sciver, for example. I've heard him rant about a lot of things, and a lot of it isn't that big a deal. I've also heard through others, you included, but he also said this, well, that's really bad. And I agree, that's really bad. Most of us don't have enough time in our day, nor do we care to know some idiot's opinion who rants and raves all the time on YouTube, right? No, that's why I don't have 1 million subscribers, right? Because I really don't care. I mean, this is for entertainment. YouTube is for entertainment. So quite frankly, this is what astonishes me about this whole controversy. And particularly when we get into, if we're getting in, I don't want to, we'll be getting into that with the whole Tom King and Jay Lee thing. But this is what bothers me, is that I believe very firmly that whether you're conservative or liberal, wherever you are on the political spectrum, or wherever you see the comic book culture overturn window being located right now, I believe that everybody just wants to write good comics, and people just want to get along with each other, and most people do. But the moment you weaponize it and you start judging somebody because you happen to know they're conservative, or you happen to know especially who they work with, are we entering like the McCarthy era where you're not going to work with somebody? Is there a blacklist in the comic book industry? How many people won't work with Chuck Dixon, a legend, because of something that he might have said or done, whatever. And look, I don't know everything he's done, but oh boy, everybody's going to white knight. And I'm sure somebody in the chat or somebody can enlighten me as to why I shouldn't like Chuck Dixon and why I should not read any of his books and comic books anymore. And this is what drives me insane. And this is where I have a bias. I have a bias because I am a huge proponent of freedom of expression. And I don't have any problem with saying if somebody says something that offends me, and if it offends me and I don't want to read the comic, the truth is, if it offends me, I'll probably be more apt to buy the comic. But in any event, we can't allow our capacity to be offended to destroy someone's career because we don't like what they're saying or how they're saying it. And that includes a degree of offensiveness against race, gender, everything, because that's part of culture. And that might be a little hard line, but that's my parents' generation. That's what they fought for. And Thomas Paine said it best from American history: those who choose to live in a democracy must also endure the consequences of doing so.
I agree with that. And I do think that, especially in America, that's sort of what capitalism is designed to do. If you don't like somebody and you don't want to support them, then don't. And that should inevitably be their downfall. You had all those issues with Louis C.K., and people kind of protesting his comedy shows. And listen, Louis C.K. is not a good person. He's not a good guy. He did some horrible fucking things. But should you protest his appearance at a venue? Like, I mean, the first of all, the venue has to make money. He has to make money. If you don't like him, don't see him. And if other people feel the same way, they won't see him and his career will fail. So I find that there are already systems in place for vile people in the entertainment space to no longer have their platform. And if they do have a platform, even like whether or not you like it or not, like that means they have an audience, and it sucks. Like, and there are so many people like that out there. For myself, like I said, I find myself fairly kind of politically and socially unaffiliated, and yet I would say 90% of the influencers I see on the internet, I look at them and I go, wow, these are the people that our culture have chosen to give a platform. That's fucking insane.
Here's my fear for guys like you, though, Dark Knight, and this is my fear for you, is that we live in a society, and I know you have aspirations of being in the comic book industry. And I'm looking forward to that signed 9.8 of your first Batman one day.
What about a 10?
Yeah, if you can get me a gem, that would be great. But my fear is that nobody will be able to be neutral. Nobody will, because you'll be forced to take a position, and that's what bothers me. And and at some point, which I'd like to give some as an example. I think Jay Lee is an example where he just wanted to be left alone to do his work and draw his covers. And maybe Jay Lee is conservative, maybe he's liberal. I don't know what Jay Lee is. We still don't know because nobody cares, except apparently at some point Tom King and Heather Antos and people who believe that they have to white knight and protect the industry from these people who have the audacity to work for a comic book company that offends them. And I just, again, I don't have objectivity on that particular issue. And it just, to me, if you're going to protect anything, protect the principle. Protect the principle and let the marketplace of ideas decide what product is going to sell and who's going to rise to the top and who isn't.
Yeah, and I think there's just been this distinct weaponization of just black and white thinking, because the world just isn't black and white. Like, let's call a fucking spade a spade. There's a reason that there are fucking thousands of gray tones between black and white, because so too is the world like that. And the problem is that you're right. That is a scary prospect. It is something I am actively afraid of, that I will be forced to choose a side in which I do not agree with the majority of their values, because frankly, I don't agree with the majority of either side's values right now. And that is scary. It's a scary prospect. And the fact of the matter is that one side is virtue signaling, right? And the other side is, if you're not with us, you're the enemy. And I think both of them actually incorporate that sort of mentality to varying degrees, but it's kind of disgusting. And before we obviously get into this really relevant and specific conversation on the Tom King Jay Lee debacle, I do want to cite Aaron VO's comment here. And he says, and I believe this is regarding the lack of actual bipartisanship and all of the bias out there in both the political and the comic book landscape. He says, that represents so much of society these days. People are arguing to show their side is the right side, not to actually find solutions. It's created a stagnation politically as well as socially. It's preventing society from growing as well as bringing back antiquated attitudes based around hate. Aaron, I couldn't agree with you more. And by the signs of my friend nodding his head, I'm very pleased to say that I think he feels the same way.
Of course.
It is disgusting that we're more interested in pointing the scope of a gun at somebody rather than figuring out how we will live in a world where we don't need to do that. And you said it oh so perfectly, and it is very present in the comic book industry. We're not looking at, for example, I think we'll, just to keep it fair, we'll bring up a complaint that Comicsgate has of the industry and a complaint that the SJWs have of the industry, right? So I feel like one of the big complaints on the SJW side is that there isn't enough representation of comic books. So they feel sometimes it maybe not maybe necessary, maybe important to sometimes commandeer characters that we know and love and to change them or replace them with characters that will represent a wider population. And rather than rather than them saying, okay, why don't we just create new characters for people to be interested in and authentically build them? Let's just hijack something else and make it something that it's not. And I can see why the other side is upset about that. As an aspiring storyteller, that laziness upsets me, because not only do I think it just deprives somebody of the creative process of making a new interesting character, there are also hundreds, if not thousands, of incredible characters that could represent different bodies of people that just aren't shown love, right? Like, why are we not taking those characters and bringing out what's best in them? You're seeing people do that with quote unquote, I would say, not representative, non-diverse characters, right? Tom King's done it twice with Vision and with Mr. Miracle. Why can't we do that with an incredible diverse character? And I think that's important. And this is not in a political way. This is just in a creative way. Those characters matter. They exist. They are tools in the tool shed. Why not use them? And so before we go over to the other side, Boom, what are you feeling about that?
Well, I would distinguish between two things, and it's very important to distinguish between these two things, in my opinion. And that is, there's a difference between on the one side, we've got the issue of equal opportunity for both genders to get a job in the comic book industry, to give them both sides equal opportunity for all representation. That's a question of equal opportunity, because there's a perception, of course, and there's certainly validity to that. It's mostly been a white male dominated industry. So the question of how do you increase representation, that is a separate issue, in my opinion. Although related, it is technically separate than the issue where you get between Tom King and Jay Lee, where you're accusing somebody of doing a series of microaggressions, or you're trying to destroy careers in order to get other people ahead. You're trying to destroy careers intentionally or otherwise, or make yourself look good, like you're white knighting. These are very, very different things. Now, of course, one way to increase representation is by getting all the white males fired because they have conservative views, if that's what most white males have in the comic book industry, by some SJW accusations. That's one way to do it. And that appears to be, in some quarters, what is happening. I don't actually see all that. I'm just saying that this is these are two distinct things. And unfortunately, they've become sort of molded together, because quite frankly, in the 90s, for example, we had affirmative action, and we still have in Canada, for example, we have affirmative action in our constitution, which says that you've got to hire a certain amount of ethnic minorities for certain government jobs, et cetera, et cetera. That might be controversial, but if you implement that, that's one way to combat the problem. It's funny that in Canada, when we implemented affirmative action programs, we never had this type of social war where people were accusing each other of being racist and hate and all this other jazz. There's people that are saying legitimately, look, Dark Knight, if you spend the next 10 years trying to make it in the industry and you earn it, and you've got merit and you've got experience, but you can't get a job because you're constantly losing out to somebody who is a different skin color than you or a different gender. Yeah, that's an issue. That's a potential issue that the industry itself has to address and can address. But that's something that has been addressed for the last 30 years, and there's different ways to address it. It doesn't necessarily mean that there has to be a language of hatred back and forth between the two sides. And what I find unfortunate about the comic book industry is that, and of course the larger cultural landscape as well, is there's just a language of hate that's taken away from the legitimate constructive debate that can be had to address the problem of representation in comic books.
Yeah, I agree. I 100% agree. And I think at the end of the day, it should be, I think representation is very important, right? Because we as, I would say as a world culture, even, I was going to say Western culture, but as a world culture, we look to these characters as icons and as, so I think at times even the basis for a lot of people's moral compasses, right? I mean, like when I was a kid, the question was always, Batman eats his vegetables. It was Batman wouldn't do this, and so I behaved, right? And you make those associations, and I think it's important to have heroes out there that look like somebody else, right? That another little kid that doesn't look like me has something to look up to, right? Someone that they can relate to. I think on a very simple level, right? Someone that looks like them. But I don't necessarily think the answer is forcing that, right? To forcing that situation there. I think that situation needs to be developed. And so you'll find on the other side, so that's kind of, a plight of the SJW side. They're kind of forcing diversity rather than developing diversity. And I think that's kind of the key delineation between what they should be, or in this order, what they should not be doing versus what they should be doing. And I would say on the right, they've taken their aggressions toward that notion and just ramped them up and accelerated them into some really hateful, bullying, antagonistic tactics. And as much as I agree with the notion that I don't want anything forced in my stories, right? Like this isn't just on the topic of representation. This is on the topic of any large scale implementation. I don't want anything forced into my stories. I think anything in a story needs to be developed. But I don't think you need to be hateful about it. I don't think, I understand why people are passionate. I get it. You get it. You and I have definitely, not in an aggressive way, but we've raised our voices at each other when we get passionate in a conversation.
Let me ask you a question, Dark Knight, because one of the things that I disagree with from from time to time, and sometimes vocally about some of the Comicsgate arguments, is that they'll point to the poor quality of storytelling. Comic books right now, and by the way, I agree. Right now, the quality of storytelling with the big two, I think, is generally, I would say, below average or below par, in my opinion. But it's not because of diversity. It's not because,
right.
and I would hasten to add that a lot of the stories I don't like happen to be written by white males. You know what I mean? I mean, you have issues with death metal. There's a couple of white male guys involved in that. But so, I mean, it's always dangerous when you point to story quality and comic book sales as a metric, as to try to justify an argument on either side of this comic book culture wars, because it's almost laughable, because there's no relationship between the two, really. And quite frankly, I can point to certain sales, I can point to certain creators that, yes, were probably hired because of their gender, and the story might not be that good because they don't have a lot of experience and it's their first time out. But I myself, I don't necessarily have an issue with that. I mean, everybody deserves a chance. I mean, you look at J.J. Abrams' son. He only got the job because of who his dad was. I mean, there's always a degree of nepotism in comics. There's always a degree of who do you know, how you're going to break in. Back in 1992, when I got into law school, I had average grades. I was still number 29 on the waiting list, and there was only 175 positions. I missed the first day of class because I was competing for only half of the 175 positions, because half, or 51%, were women, 10% were Aboriginals, 5% had to be outside Canada, different ethnic groups. I was actually competing for about 35 positions back in the day, even in 1992, and I accepted it because that's part of the diversity of my country. And it didn't seem to bother me as much back then, but now all of a sudden it seems so weird that now, 25, 30 years later, everybody seems to be up in the arms about diversity. And I'm thinking, it's been part of my life for so long, and I don't feel like I'm racist. I just want a good comic book, and it really bothers me, and I get defensive. Am I fragile? Am I a white fragile? Just like that book, White Fragility. Do we suffer from white fragility? I don't know what's going on.
Well, I think there's, when it comes to that end, I think it'd be more important to open institutions for people who want to get into the comic book industry and just making that accessible, right? Because first of all, most people's first comic books fucking suck. Like, they're really bad. And the industry is not easy to get into, honestly, especially for writers. It's not easy. You can't just go and show your portfolio to an editor. You have to publish, and that's expensive. And if you want to sell, you need to know people in order to get your book out there to sell the books. It's really daunting. It's really, really difficult. So I feel like, first of all, why not make an institution that's super accessible to get more voices out there into the industry? Teach them the craft, right? Make them talented enough to develop stories, to develop perspectives, and a number of other important things in their storytelling, right? Like, give them the tools to do it rather than just telling them to do it and making their own tools, because just like cavemen, the tools are going to be blunt and they're going to be largely ineffective and inefficient. And that's an important thing to talk about, right? And I say this, with full awareness that I am a straight white male, right, who is of middle class origin, but I've also seen a lot of, I think, just a complete and utter lack of understanding from either side, right? Like, people just aren't, like Aaron said earlier, people aren't interested in understanding, I would say, the validity to various degrees of either side, and they're only really focusing on things that they can weaponize against their opposition rather than trying to come to an understanding. And you see that in this subtopic here, the Tom King and Jay Lee debacle. So for those of you that are unaware, basically Tom King, to my displeasure, is going to be writing a Rorschach maxi series. And it came out about a week ago, maybe, that artist Jay Lee was going to do was doing the main variant cover for that book, and apparently Jay Lee had been hired some months ago to do a cover for Ethan Van Sciver, the kind of mouthpiece for the comic skate movement, to do a cover for his book. Now, Jay Lee has very little awareness of this sort of tumultuous comic book online space, and to him it was a job. It was a job by at the time who he thought was a well-respected comic book artist, and frankly it was in order to put food on his plate and his wife's plate, and if he has kids, his kids' plate, and he was unaware of the implications behind that. And Tom King came out, made public statements about how disappointed he was, about how he did not consider that to be a cover to his book, and basically completely disavowing this man before actually discussing it with him in private. And because of that, it affected Jay Lee on a very personal level. He heard about all these things on a day where I believe he had lost a family pet. And obviously, Tom King has certainly garnered himself quite a reputation and quite I would say a firm foothold in the comic book industry, and likely had impacted Jay Lee's career and his social life within the industry in a very negative way without actually gathering information. And, there's a bit of a debate going on right now where some people are calling for some very, very harsh repercussions for Tom King because of the mistake that he made. And others are saying that somehow Jay Lee should have been aware, and that his ignorance does not absolve him of impact, in the words of Heather Antos. And it's gotten pretty rocky. And so I'm curious, Boom. We've talked very, very, very briefly about this, but laying all the cards out on the table, this Tom King, Jay Lee situation, where are you going with this?
Well, okay. Well, get ready for a rant. All right. Now, first of all, let me just say this in defense of Tom King, because after I tell the defense of Tom King, I'm going to rip him apart and tell you what comic books of Tom King I won't be getting for the foreseeable future. He gave a hell of an apology, Tom King, and he bloody well should have. And that's all he can do, because there's really not much else he can do unless he's punished. And the only thing I can do to punish him farther, because he deserves to be punished, is to not buy his comic books. Mm-hmm. So that's what I'm doing. But make no mistake that he apologized, and boy, did he apologize. There's no mistake this was an apology. He fell on a sword, and he should have. Good for him. Kudos to him, because you don't see BITCHs like Heather Antos falling on their sword and apologizing. And boy, oh boy, should they be apologizing to the comic book community ad nauseum for some of their conduct over the last 3 years. I'm just saying. So I give Tom King credit for that. Now we can debate whether or not the apology was required by DC Comics, saying apologize now and make it good. And by the way, I just want to say that when Tom King was in the middle of all this, Tom King's original tweet, he said that he was not aware that Jay Lee was doing the alternate cover for Rorschach. So those of you who want to criticize Jay Lee for not knowing about Comicsgate, maybe you should, why doesn't Tom King know about who's doing his alternate covers for DC? Not that DC owes Tom King anything. It's none of Tom King's business who DC gets to do the alternate covers. He says he was unaware of it, and then he makes reference of Jay Lee working for Dynamite, who was involved with the Cecil controversy with the Red Sonja Vampirella cover. And so he does that, and then he says he has a conversation with Jay Lee, and that it's all good. It's been best possible outcome. He said best possible outcome. Well, Jay Lee then gave a statement that was printed by Bleeding Cool, and Jay Lee made it very clear that it's not okay, and that people are still attacking Jay Lee, including the one of the editors at Valiant Comic Books, Heather Antos.
She's not just an editor; she's a senior editor.
Senior editor, yes.
Yeah.
And I want to be clear. I'm not. I call her a BITCH because I can. But if I worked in the comic book industry, I wouldn't be able to talk like truth to power. But in any event, she was also one of the she was also editor-in-chief over at Marvel. And don't get me wrong, Heather's taken a beating online.
Well, she was an editor, not an editor-in-chief.
She was an editor, right, at Marvel, right? She was a minor editor, hired by Axel Alonso early on, and she's gone through the ringer too on social media. But she's wrong on this point. She's very wrong on this point. And what bothers me about this is, and I'm not. I'll let you can be more objective on this, because I don't have a lot of objectivity on this one point, and that is that I don't care if Jay Lee knows exactly who Comicsgate is, and he's done a thesis on Comicsgate for Harvard. He wants to draw covers for Dynamite. He wants to draw provocative covers for Dynamite, and that's exactly what he did. He's not responsible for who writes the comics, the story content, or anything else, nor should he be. And do you really want to work in an industry that would actually do that? That would actually, what are you going to have a little group session where you're going to hold hands, sing Kumbaya, and compare political notes to make sure you all have the same group think before you do a comic book? This is absolutely appalling that Jay Lee had to go through this. So I'll stop talking and just say to Tom King, good for you to apologize, but I'm not getting Rorschach, Batman, Catwoman. I'm not getting that. And whatever else you got coming out, buddy, I'm not reading it. Oh, I canceled my Strange Adventures too as of issue 3.
Wow. Well, I mean, I wasn't going to get any of those books anyways because they're inevitably bad. But regarding this actual situation, I can't tell if Tom King's apology was via his own volition or via DC Comics. And I think it was actually to his detriment that he came out and tried to veil the severity of the situation by saying it was all good, when it wasn't. It clearly was not. In fact, I won't, and it is, maybe it's not my place because he didn't make the apology to me, but I wouldn't accept Tom King's apology to Jay Lee. I wouldn't accept his apology to the fans unless he went out of his way to get Jay Lee high-profile comic book jobs, because there is no doubt in my mind that Jay Lee lost opportunities for comic book jobs because of Tom King's statement and because of the clout that he carries with him. It's frustrating because, admittedly, for as much, and I've done it a lot, as I have criticized Tom King's work, I've always found Tom King to be respectable. I've never, ever had a problem with the way Tom King carried himself. In fact, when I hated his Batman and people were actually being just horrible human beings to this man, I defended him. I went out of my way to say whether or not you like his Batman is no reason to comment on his character or the legitimacy of his place in life or whatever. That's not your point. You can comment on how much you hate his Batman. That's perfectly fine, but it has no inclination on his character as a human being. But Tom, you fucked up, buddy. You fucked up big time. And for somebody who worked at the Central Intelligence Agency, you did a lot of fucking talking before you gathered intelligence. And that is a fundamental misstep. I certainly was not going to buy Rorschach. I certainly was not going to buy his Batman Catwoman. But I'm far less inclined to even support Strange Adventures, of which I think is a fine story so far, on the ground that I think it's irresponsible. And I think he should face repercussions. And I don't hate Tom King right now. I think he did a really bad thing. And I think he needs to make up for it. And I think he needs to face repercussions.
Yeah. I just want to add one thing that, I don't hate him either, but like I said, there has to be a repercussion. And the only way I, as a consumer, can act is if by not buying his stuff. And look, I'm not saying I'm never going to buy a Tom King comic again. I'll just give you another example. The only other time I ever did that was, well, there was actually a number of times, but the last time that comes to mind that I'll make was Kelly Sue DeConnick. I love Kelly Sue DeConnick as a writer. I know I don't agree with her politically, but I love her as a writer. I love Bitch Planet. I was loving Bitch Planet. And then along came Howard Chaykin, and he wrote a series called The Divided States of America. and he on a cover he had a trans character hanging that had a very violent cover image of a trans person hanging from a theater on the cover of Divided States of Hysteria. That's what it was. Divided States of Hysteria, #1. The entire premise of the comic book was about the United States being in a state of hysteria and violence, and it was, well, I won't go into the story, it's irrelevant. She went on such a tirade against Howard Chaykin, wanting people to ban the book, and Howard Chaykin, God love the man, he didn't take any of their crap, and I basically boycotted the last 3 issues of Bitch Planet. To this day, I love that series, but I had to do it. And I did it purely on the grounds of the First Amendment. Like, you don't tell somebody, you don't tell somebody not to buy. I just find something so galling. Can you imagine the sheer audacity? If I said to you in all seriousness, Dark Knight, I don't want you to, you don't buy this. If you buy this comic book, you're a racist. If the quickest way to get me to buy a comic book is if you piss me off, lip me off, and have the audacity to tell me what I think or believe, I'm going to go check that comic book out. And what I did is that I bought 3 issues of every issue of Divided States of Hysteria, and I gave them away for free at my comic shop. All 6 issues.
So on that Comic Boom, if you buy my comic book, you're a cretin, because the writer is a pretentious bastard that thinks that he knows what he's doing. There, I said it.
Yeah. And by the way, I went back to collecting Kelly Sue DeConnick after Bitch Planet. I'm loving her Aquaman run.
It's great.
Don't get me wrong.
Very good.
But it's just, this is, as a consumer, if you upset me and you upset my sensibilities and you take it upon yourself to tell me what I'm supposed to think, or you purport to tell other people what to think, like, here's the thing. Do you think I'm buying your comic book because I think that you're some sort of great social commentator and shit? No, you're a writer. You make crap up. All right. If you want to say something profound, put it in your comic, put it in your writing, and educate me there. But don't sit there and try to play politician, okay? I mean, I think we have enough. It's bad enough we live in a world where celebrities become politicians and presidents, don't you think?
I agree on the grounds that I just don't think policing thought is the way to go about it. If you don't like somebody, you don't like somebody, and you are 100% free to voice those things. I've done it, but I think that the mentality of like virtue signaling, whether or not to engage or consume somebody else's work is just totally unproductive. I mean, you talked about Hitler's Mein Kampf. It is a consistent best-selling book. There are political and military leaders that read his book to study from it. And obviously, Hitler was an absolutely vile excuse for a human being, but there's clearly some sort of impact that his literature is having on the world, and good people have read that book. So it's such a tough scenario, man, because you have one side that so I would say the SJWs would look at you and virtue signal you and see you as this absolutely despicable human being for consuming the art of someone that they deem unvirtuous. And then on the other side, if you happen to argue, well, I don't want to buy this book because I just don't like this person, you'd be considered a snowflake. And there are critiques on both sides, 100%. Yeah. But it's just frustrating that we can't just say, you buy what you buy, I buy what I buy. I can make my case, you can make your case, and we just walk away. We're done. I mean, let's be real. I'm not going to act like I haven't spoken my case. In my Death Metal 2 review, I straight up said, please don't buy this book, please, because this is not the direction I want the DC universe to go into. But I'm not mad at anybody for buying it. In fact,
you didn't tell people not to buy it because it's racist or because the writer, or you didn't tell people Scott Snyder was a racist, bigoted fool, and you didn't insult the writer or the creative team for on a personal level because of their skin color or something else, or because of some purported political groupthink. I mean, this is the this is the stuff what it's come to. And this is stuff we're having a live stream on this. And by the way, this is a topic that has gotten people banned on YouTube. I don't know if it's a good thing you're not monetized already. You'd probably be demonetized on this because this is the type of thing that just seems to upset people. I feel compelled to say one thing because I don't want to make this think this is one-sided. I want to say that there's been a lot of the number of women that it's increased, the number of women who've become writers in the comic book industry in the last 5 years, and it's growing, and diversity. And some of the great, there's a lot of great writers out there and up and coming writers that are, that I love. I think it's Viola Ayala. I really like her. Mariko Tamaki. I wasn't really a big fan of hers. I was actually impressed with her first issue of Wonder Woman. There's a whole slew of writers. Stephanie Phillips writes A Man Among Ye, writes Artemis and the Assassin. And she just wrote a Red Tornado story for DC's Summer, DC Cybernetic Summer. I should also say that Scott Snyder just mentioned that they're having another writer's workshop for DC. And he's inviting resumes for that. And so, this is something where, they want to, I think that's one of the ways that DC is combating this. And this is one of the things that the big two, for PR reasons, just to, encourage diversity, get the writers in there, have these writing workshops, because the quality of writing has been down at DC, and it hasn't been because you can't sit there and say it's because of gender or this or that or whatever. Look, a bad story is a bad story. Anybody can write a bad story. Anybody can write a good story. I don't care if you're purple, green, or yellow, or from Uranus. I don't care. Anybody can do it. It's a question of putting into place a system where you get the best people together and you train them, you give them the best experience possible by the best writers possible, and you go from there. I like that DC is doing that. And I just, I don't like having these types of topics. Of all the topics that we've had out of the 51, this is the one that actually, frankly, aggravates me the most. And I love having these live streams, but I don't like getting borderline upset like I'm feeling talking about this, because we in the comic book industry, I think that we're some of the best people around. Good Lord, we're like little boys who believe in superheroes, and then ironically enough, so many of us are accused of being bigots, and it just, after a while, it just gets really aggravating.
Well, it's a weird thing, because I guess this is where my skeptical nature kind of manifests itself, because I do think that there are a lot of not great people on both sides. Frankly, I've seen a lot of people. We've named a few on both sides tonight that I absolutely despise their ethics and the way they go about manifesting those ethics in their career, on their social platform, in their art even. I just don't think this is the place to do it, and I don't think that we should have to do it this way. You know what I mean? At the end of the day, I don't know. Like, I see no importance in signaling how things should be done on a political level. I think we should just be looking at things on the most human level possible, right? Like, when you break down the comic book industry, what are you doing? You're doing two things. One, you're creating a narrative art form to tell a story, and two, you sell books, right? Those are the two tent poles of comic book publishing. And when politics get in the way of both those things from both sides, you have a huge problem. And when politics define those two things, there is, I would say, complete disjunction, in the moving parts of that machine. And that's a problem, right? It should, at the end of the day, be about generating good stories that matter, that people buy because they connect with them. And when you get into all of these different movements, about somebody being mad that somebody's getting offended, about people getting offended over nothing, about people, wanting to fast track things rather than develop things, about people saying, comic books should just be tits and ass and people punching each other. There are problems on both sides. And I think that it's just this product of this really, really I would say this aggressive social atmosphere that we're seeing around the world, and there's also obviously this anonymous component on the internet. Whether or not you are 100% actually anonymous, you are typing at a screen rather than look at somebody in the face. Because I guarantee you that on both sides, right? Whether it's Ethan Van Sciver being a bigot or whether it's Heather Antos trying to be a gatekeeper, neither one of them would do half the shit they're doing if they looked the other person in the eye. And that's one of the biggest problems, is that we're absolutely disconnecting from humanity, and we're so much more interested in proving our point, in validating ourselves and our own views, rather than, as Aaron said at the beginning of this conversation, trying to find an actual solution, trying to make all of the cogs in this wonderful fucking comic book machine work, because that's what we should be prioritizing. And it's frustrating, really frustrating, as somebody who aspires to break into this industry, because I have to worry about politics becoming the end all be all for my career rather than creating good art. And again, I consider myself a moderate thinker. I consider myself somebody unaffiliated with either one of these sides. And I would say that as somebody who is very self-aware. But the fact of the matter is that I don't think that's going to work out for me, and it's a scary thing, and it doesn't work out on any level whatsoever. And when you become silent on either side, you're a culprit on either side. Both ends of this argument are trying to weaponize inactivity as much as they're trying to weaponize their opposing views. And it sucks. It's hurtful. And it's going to damage the fandom. It's going to damage the industry by sales. It's going to damage the creative pool of people that are telling these stories. And ultimately, it can do nothing but bad. Yeah. And it's really frustrating.
Yeah, and I also want to take this opportunity while we're on the subject to point out that it's not just Tom King, and because I do want to point out other people who suffer from hypocrisy, and these are people I'm going to name names because they deserve to be named, and these are people that I also think are very great writers that I love their writing. And Mark Russell, Gail Simone, Jim Zub, all worked for Dynamite, all had no problem working for Dynamite, but of course, the social media tide sways, and then suddenly they're on a particular bandwagon so they can white knight. And they're suddenly they don't want to do Mark Russell. It'll be his last work for Dynamite when he finishes his Red Sonja story, and it's too bad. He's a great writer. I'm enjoying his Red. I've collected Red Sonja for 30 years, and Red Sonja, she's tits and ass. That's what she is. When Gail Simone, when she wrote Red Sonja, she said straight up she didn't want to write it. She wrote it because her mother wanted her to. So what does that say about your mother, Gail? Now, I'm not insulting Gail Simone's mother. I think Gail Simone's mother has very good taste, and I think Gail Simone has very good taste because she wrote Red Sonja. I think Jim Zub, he loves Conan the Barbarian. He loves Red Sonja. He's written some too. And the bottom line is that they made decisions. These are creatively brilliant people, and I respect them all. But it's hard for me. I'm disappointed in them when they don't when they exercise this level of hypocrisy. And judging an entire comic book company and choosing not to work for them because of a couple of affiliations, because of the politics of a couple of creators for Dynamite. Finally, I want to call out any comic book retailer that has refused to call Dynamite, has refused to sell Dynamite comic books. I won't swear like Dark Knight does, but I want to use 4-letter language, but I won't. But F you all the way. That is to refuse to sell Dynamite comic books. Thank you for white knighting, purporting to be controlling what your readership might want. And don't give me the excuse that nobody bought or nobody was ordering Dynamite at your comic store anyway. Don't give me that nonsense. You're pathetic. You're hypocrites. And you're probably in the state of California. Hello, Ryan Higgins of whatever comic conspiracy. I'm calling you out in particular. You don't want to sell Dynamite? That's fine. But you're a hypocrite, and that's what you are. And bear in mind that there's a price you pay for not having any principles while purporting to have them. And I'll just leave it at that.
I mean, I think I'm not as hostile on that subject, I think, as you are. I think the one thing that is worth mentioning is that, I guarantee you that a number of those creators made those decisions and voiced themselves that way publicly because they're afraid of the mob mentality, because they're afraid of, of what their image, what their reputation is going to look like if they don't disavow Dynamite for the sort of displeasure that the very vocal Twitter community has had about them. And I'm sure some of them are genuine, but and that's their prerogative. They can do whatever the hell they want. It's their careers. But I think the part of it is certainly that these artists feel necessary to compromise their art because of those awkward associations. And I think also this idea of virtue signaling people to not work for Dynamite, or virtue signaling creators to maybe not do a cover for somebody that might be in that Comicsgate space is really fucked, because first of all, the comic book industry already isn't an easy place to make a living. You going to pay their bills? Like, they're trying to get their name out there. They're trying to get experience. That's their craft. That's what they do. If Pablo Picasso, when he was early on in his career, you think he wasn't going to do a painting for someone he thought bigoted? I doubt that. It's just not how it works. Like, and I can, whether or not Jay Lee actually knew, he's putting food on the table for one of his kids. And you know what? Jay Lee wasn't one of those artists. He's not a Jim Lee. He's not one of those guys that just says, hey, I have availability, and people are chomping at the chain to get at him. He's well known, but he's not taking those high profile jobs. And so, to look at somebody and say, hey, you, because of my political beliefs, you should not be putting fucking food on your table. And that's a big problem that I have with this. And again, let's be clear for anybody that might be joining us in the middle of this. I'm not a Comicsgate guy. I am not Comicsgate. I don't like a grand majority of what I have seen from them. I don't hate people that identify as that, but I've seen a great amount of things that I find very distasteful coming from that. But I also don't think it's fair to tell anybody what jobs they should or should not take, because it's their career, it's their pocket, it's their livelihood, it's their craft. And you cannot take that away from somebody, or you should not. And the fact of the matter is that we're putting the industry in a situation where you are doing that. And I guarantee you that on both sides of the fence, because of that pressure, you are going to have people start to double down on either side in the most narrow-minded way possible, because that's the only way they can get themselves work. I guarantee you see that on both sides. You might have seen that from a couple of the creators you'd mentioned leaving Dynamite. You probably see that with guys that voice their distaste with somebody who has a following of the SJW camp and feels the need to double down on the sort of Comicsgate mentality so that they can find themselves some sort of financial security. You're forcing people to make decisions, and it is not within anybody's right to force anybody to think or do anything.
That's right. I choose to believe, I really choose to believe that the vast majority of those in the comic book industry, I believe that there is probably far more are conservative in nature and are against the cancel culture that exists now. Because that's what this is. This is cancel culture in the comic book industry. This is what it's become. It's cancel culture. And at some point, this is just the beginning. And I hope it ends. I hope it's over. And it's, it is what it is. And, I just... maybe I've been a little bit too vocal than I normally should, because I know on Twitter, I literally have to shut my Twitter off sometimes, or just go, because there's so much I could tweet, but I don't, because I know I'm just going to get a backlash by a bunch of uneducated idiots, and I don't have time for the nonsense. And make no mistake that, I just and by the way, the vast majority of YouTube is there's a price, people that are like Tom King had these wherewithal to apologize, and good for him, because he needs to. Tom King's career is saved because of that apology. And Jay Lee's career is going to be fine. It's going to be just fine. And as a matter of fact, I continue to buy Jay Lee covers, and I'm going to promote him here. He's a fantastic artist. And, you know, I'll say, you know, buy what you love. And if you're the type of person that's going to decide which comic books you buy, but before you buy them, you need to know the politics of the writers, and you have to agree with the politics of the writers. Well, then you know, if I had to agree with every bit of politics of, I don't know. I don't even know what all the politics of all the different writers are, whether it's Gail Simone or Mark Russell or Mark Waid. Maybe we wouldn't. I'm a little bit more conservative. They're probably more liberal. Would we agree on the same things? No, but do I think there's some of my favorite writers of all time? Yes. I mean, I can say both those things and they can both be true.
It's outstanding. Just how much of a hole a lot of people are getting put in, because, you know, I think some people are kind of being forced into being quiet because they're afraid of having a moderate point of view, because they're afraid at poking both sides, because then both sides will weaponize their beliefs and their following to attack that person in the middle, you know. And again, you're getting people that see that oncoming attack and realize that in order not to be decimated, they have to pick a side and double down. And you're seeing that more and more and more and more. And then you're seeing people that head either one of those camps that are just kind of hateful people, you know. Like, I mean, I'll look right into the camera. Like the main voices of Comicsgate, I find you hateful. The main voices of the SJW movement in comics, I find you just as hateful. You can both fuck off. And I say that as an aspiring comic book creator. And the fact of the matter is like, frankly, before we had this conversation, I was a little bit scared to have it because I have aspirations of being in the comic book industry. But you know what? I'm just so over kind of having to tiptoe around this stuff, really, because it should not be a political thing. You don't like, and if you don't like somebody because of their politics, that's fine. Don't buy their shit. You can say, you know, you can put your information out there into the ethos on your platform, but to try to prevent somebody from doing what they do, physically preventing them from doing it, is just out of this world. If you don't like it, don't support it. Voice your opinion, right? Put the information out there, and other people may agree with you. They may not. Let people choose. Stop trying to take away people's right to choose. It's insane. And first of all, the comic book industry should be about comics. That's it. I don't care. I don't care your politics, right? Like, and if you're a garbage human being and I don't want to work with you, that's also my prerogative. But for fuck's sake, can we just make good comics?
I want to add one thing. I want to add one thing to what you said, and that is that when I say, now I can't speak for you, but when I say that I don't care about a person's politics, that does not, like, I want to be clear. I don't care if a person puts their politics in their comic book. Like, and this is something people might disagree with me on this. Okay. But look, if you're the writer of your comic book, so if you want to put your politics in your writing, that's your prerogative. It's not my place to tell you, you know. I don't understand people that say when they buy a comic book, well, I feel like he or she is forcing their politics down my throat. Well, look, there's a difference between forced storytelling, where you're forcing a point, versus forcing politics. All right. And yeah, certainly there's some issues where it feels like, well, we know, if you know the writer is very political, like, for example, Ta-Nehisi Coates on Captain America. I know he's a political commentator and writer. He's a social commentator. Now, I never felt, when I read his Captain America, I don't feel that he's forcing his politics down my throat. I'm actually interested. He's got a point of view about his America that I find fascinating. I don't need to agree with it to still find it fascinating. Yeah, and you and I have disagreed about the respective, you know, quality of his writing, but it's not, we've never mentioned the politics of it in our discussions. You know, I mean, that's really not the point. It's, you know, you can have a good or bad story irregardless of the degree of politics that is in it. And that's one thing that I've always disagreed with a lot of comic skaters commentary about. They complain so much. If they see an ounce of politics in a comic book and it's written by a woman, well, it must be a feminist agenda. Or they see an ounce of politics in a comic book and it's written by a black man, well, it must be a political. Well, no, actually, maybe it's just part of the story, you know? So I do think, because I want to give some pushback here, because I'm not, I've been hard on one side here, but I want to be clear. A lot of comic skaters, I think, got their head right up their ass because they're totally missing the point. If you don't like a story, just say you don't like the story, but don't sit there and say that, good God, if you're buying a Captain America comic book and it's written by a social comment, and I think you kind of lose a little bit of the prerogative to sit there and say, well, I feel like he's forcing me to be, I'm forcing his political agenda on me. Seriously? You've been buying now for 6 issues. Why don't you stop collecting if you feel forced? Who controls your brain? Like this nonsense that somehow, nobody can force their politics down my throat in their comic book any more than Scott Snyder can turn me into a Batman Who Laughs analog character, Dr. Batman Hatton. Do you know what I mean? It's nonsense. And I think it's important to give that kind of pushback there too, because the comic skate narrative that somehow all of comic books has become politicized is just nonsense, in my opinion.
Well, I think also too that argument they totally forget that comic book started as political. Like all of our favorite comic book characters began as some sort of political commentary. Really, like Superman was about giving what happens when you give an actual alien, right, of the United States, like godly power, and what does he do with it, right? The X-Men are about what happens when you sort of science fictionalize the idea of discrimination in America, right? It's there. It's in the DNA. That is all baked in the DNA. And to say that comic books are not to some degree political is outrageous. Specifically with Big Two Comics, I strongly believe that if you are going to be political, it does actually need to cater to that character. You can't force your political views on a character if they're not already part of the character's political views, right? You can't suddenly make Ollie Queen, super right wing. It doesn't make sense, and you can't make Superman in the main continuity, one or the other. It's the fact of the matter is that. In the Big Two Comics, obviously, there's going to be restrictions, right? Because there's a characterization to some degree that you need to abide by, or a level of it, in the same way that you need to do that with your politics. But especially if you're telling your own story, or an Elseworlds, or whatever, you do whatever the fuck you want. And if it's not a well-written story, I'll tell you, sweetheart, I'm not buying it. At the end of the day, I'm going to look at a comic book on the merits of its craft, right? And if somebody craftily weaves in their political views, and it is to the strength of the story, right? If it moves that story, if it presents those characters in different ways, I'm going to enjoy it. American Carnage, for example, one of the best books of 2019. Hard fucking stop. It's an excellent fucking book, and it is highly political. And I give the writer a lot of credit because I think it's very politically moderate and it pokes at both sides, but it certainly leans one side more than the other. And there are certain small nuances that I don't agree with, but you know what? It was really well fucking crafted. And that was not, and the political views presented in that book were not to the detriment of that story, the characters, the narrative. In fact, they moved all of those things and pushed them forward. So like you said, I'm going to use your own words. Let's get our fucking heads out of our asses for a second and think that you can't express yourself in your fucking art, because at the end of the day, that's what it is. But there's again, I just kind of want to end that segment on just saying there are so many problems with both sides. There's gatekeeping on both sides, right? Both of which say that the other side is gatekeeping, both of which I guess to varying degrees are true, because they are. One side is saying that you need to do this, you need to do that. The other side is saying, well, comic books are just this, they are just that, they are, just this simplistic thing, and they're not. Both sides can actually go fuck themselves when it comes to that regard.
Yeah.
Because comic books are whatever the fuck whoever is creating them want them to be. They can be propaganda pieces. They can be stories about a father and a son. They can be stories about the world, our political landscape. They can be about how fucking green the grass is. It can be whatever the fuck you want it to be because it's art. That's what it is. It's made to reflect whoever is creating it. And if you don't like it, don't buy it on either account, whether you're the SJW group or Comicsgate. If you don't like it, don't buy it. You're obviously welcome to voice your opinions, and you can be as harsh on it or as kind to it as you want to be, but don't attack people's character. People's character have nothing to do with the art that they make. I know wonderful people that have written characters that are horrible. Scott Snyder, great guy, has done great work, has done horrible work, has written horrible, and by horrible characters, I mean just fucked up characters that do fucked up things. Does it make them a bad person? No, because it's a part of the storytelling. So stop trying to project what people are doing in their work on their character as well. And I won't say that that doesn't happen where people do project themselves through their work, but don't assume. Assumptions will get you fucking nowhere.
Yeah, well, I'm ranted out. I've said my piece on this subject, and I probably said too much. Some of it might come back to bite me in the ass, but it actually feels therapeutic for me. I had a Rickard's Rattler, and I had one Corona, and I got a lot off my chest, so I feel better. I can go watch. Yeah. I'm binge watching Sons of Anarchy with the wife. We're on at the end of season 2 right now, so So life is good.
At the end of the day, and this kind of, we'll move into the last little conclusion of the conversation here. And it's the amount of control that social media has proven to express on obviously the world. Like, we're seeing this on very large scale platforms, but it's starting to trickle down into the comic book industry. And it's very frustrating when, not only do we have to worry about these companies being complete and utter sellouts when it comes to stories, we now have to worry about some sort of political implications, both of which interfere with the quality of the storytelling. So it's kind of depressing to say that social media has had, I think, an overwhelmingly negative impact on the comic book industry, especially as of late. You've seen it again in a couple of the specific examples, most recently with the Tom King J. Lee issue. But at the end of the day, it should just be the reception of the books. The fans should control the comic book industry. This should be in some ways democratic, or like a democratic republic, and yet it's not. So I don't know what to tell you. Boom, if you were to kind of boil this down, how would you reflect the powers or how would you describe the ruling powers of the comic book industry? Are they the companies themselves? Are they the vocal folks on the internet? And what implications do you think that has on the comic book industry in the future?
When all is said and done, there's no question in my mind that all DC and Marvel care about, they're corporations. Warner wants to make money, and Disney wants to make money. So Marvel Comics has to make money, and DC Comics has to make money, and they're going to do whatever it takes to do that. And so they always want to be on the right side, and I don't mean that in the political sense. They want to be on whatever side is the most favorable and is going to sell the most comic books. They want to be on that side. So the pendulum's always going to it's always going to go back and forth. All right, if everybody had jumped on Tom King and said, Tom King, thank you for calling out DC for that cover of Jay Lee, Tom King wouldn't have apologized. Of course he wouldn't have, right? Because you do what you have to do to make sure you're on the right side of social media, or on the, you know what I mean, the right. You want to be perceived favorably by social media. That's just it's the world that we live in. I hate to say it, but I mean, I think that's just the way it is. Social media is, it's the bane of our existence, but it's also the future of our existence. I mean, the economy is governed by social media now. Money is governed by social media. There's the economy, arguably, even in these pandemic times, we're being saved because of social media. It's both good and bad. And I've said before, the devil's in the details, but so are the angels, because at least with social media, Tom King can screw up, but he can also apologize. He can also make amends. We can also have these types of conversations where we can maybe disagree and we can still be friends.
Yeah,
And we can still get along. And it's about the dialogue and about pushing the matter forward. And, you know, the only way that you can defeat a bad argument is by by bringing light to it, by talking about it. And I always say, you know, one of the best lessons that I learn all the time as a lawyer is that I lose arguments all the time. I win some and I lose some. And I say the biggest thing that people need to do is, if people only learn the art of losing an argument, you know, it's not that bad. Every argument I've lost, and I've lost some with you, I don't lose sleep over it.
Like our Watchmen debate?
Every time I have. I don't know about that, but you had some good points. Every time I have, though, I've become enlightened. Because when you think about it, first of all, you got to have enough strength of character to acknowledge that you've lost some arguments. And when you have, you learn anything. Well, if you can concede that the other party has some good points, then you're halfway there. What's good about what I'm hoping is the positive consequence of the King Lee controversy is that maybe that's a wake-up call. Because they were both higher profile creators, they weren't lower profile Gamergator nonsense creators. Tom King is a big name. Jay Lee is kind of a big name too. And maybe that dispute was kind of a wake-up call for the industry, where people are gonna sit back. Because I don't know about you, but what really shocked me was Scott Snyder retweeted all the criticism of Tom King. Some of the tweets that criticized Tom King were retweeted by Scott Snyder. That tells you something right there. There was a lot of people in the industry who silently, you could tell. I'm not gonna. I don't even want to mention names, but I was pleasantly surprised by how many creators that I love were retweeting the criticisms of Tom King. And they were movers and shakers in the industry as well. So that tells me that maybe there's hope. That maybe at the end of this culture war tunnel, which is, because again, the comic book culture war is a small microcosm of the larger cultural landscape that right now is in a state of chaos. And I think, you know, as things die down a little bit, you know, there's that expression from, I think from the Hangover movie, you know, check yourself before you wreck yourself. Yeah. That's what I think all of us have to do. And, you know, I do it by drinking Corona and doing live streams.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to flaws that we're seeing, I think, very prevalently in the world at large. People lack self-awareness. I think people lack. I mean, you said it, and I'm trying to find a way to say it in pretty much one word. People lack the ability to be humble. You know, they lack the ability to take their losses and to learn from them. And the fact of the matter is that, you know, the way humans process information is we're meant to lose. We're meant to lose so that we can learn how to win. You don't just win. You don't just make things happen. You don't just succeed. You fail and you learn from those failures. So I think that we've also just generated this really uncomfortable atmosphere where people feel like they can't fail, where failure becomes the end all be all. That becomes what defines you. Being wrong that one time. I've been wrong a lot of times. I've had people call me out on my shit. And frankly, I consider myself to be someone that doesn't like to make an argument unless they feel comfortable and informed on the argument they make. And I've still lost those arguments. And you know what? I'm glad I did, because I became a better person for it, because I learned from those things. And people are afraid of that. And you're seeing that very much in the comic book industry. And you're starting to see this, you know, this really aggressive sort of landscape where people feel like they can't admit that they were wrong. And because of the sort of pressures that come with, you know, virtue signaling or whoever's in power, you feel like you need to apologize for things that you might not actually genuinely feel you need to apologize for. So you're getting it on both ends. People are making half-assed apologies they don't mean, and some people aren't apologizing when they probably should. And it's ridiculous. And I can only hope that, whatever happens, specifically with the Tom King Jay Lee situation, that he makes right by Jay Lee rather than just, typing a couple things on Twitter. I think he owes it to Jay Lee as a fellow professional, as a man, to try to, make up for his mistake that has undoubtedly affected Jay Lee in a very negative way. So at the end of the day, man, when it comes to comic books, I would love to be in a place where we don't have to have this conversation, where we don't have to discuss one person doing wrong by another person because they didn't gather all the information they needed to before making a statement. Let's just make stories matter. Let's talk about stories. Let's do things. Let's create art that impacts people, that people can connect with, that teaches people, right?
I'm gonna add to that. I'm gonna tell to everyone out there, if you are somebody, regardless of who you are, next time you walk into a comic shop, buy a comic book that offends you for that very reason and read it. Buy it because it offends you. Read it. Discover something. Is it really that bad? And if it is, fine, but read it. Train yourself, because otherwise, consider the possibility that you're a snowflake. Because in the past, what people normally did, if anything offended them, and they were always offended, we used to have a name for people that were always pissed off, always offended with people, always critical of people. We had special names for them. Asshole, jerk, prick. The list goes on. Nowadays, they go by different names, and some of them have platforms, and they like, squeaky wheel gets the grease, be critical, just do it all for clickbait. And, at the end of the day, if that's the type of person that you want to be, that's, I guess that's a choice. But at the end of the day, I'm hoping that the better angels of our nature in comic books, it's going to manifest itself. And these people that are, think that their SHIT doesn't stink. They're finding out the hard way that it does. And, again, we're picking on Tom King here. And to be quite honest, Tom King, I'm going to say again that Tom King at least apologized. The people who deserve a lot more criticism than Tom King have never apologized. And quite frankly, I think they probably deserve to get called out too, but that's not in our, I've ranted enough and ranted enough about that. But this is probably a good time for me to keep my mouth shut.
I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's just remembering that we're all human, right? Like, we're going to make mistakes, some more drastic than others. And I think Boom and I can both agree, as much as we very much feel like Tom King needs to face the consequences for his very severely ignorant actions. I don't think either of us hate him. I'm not going to belittle Tom King's character. And I think it's important to realize how important taking a step back and realizing when you've made a mistake is, because that's the only thing that's going to let you grow. But at the end of the day, I want to thank everybody for watching. I know this is a very different kind of conversation, but I felt it sort of necessary because there's a lot of hyper aggressive people on both sides. And as somebody who has a very small platform, I just felt it was time to add what I think to be a very considerate and a very moderate point of view to this conversation, and just say that if you're too far on either side, odds are you're nowhere near the right answer. The answer should just be trying to find a solution to the aggression and to the distaste that you have with one another, and just make good comics, make good stories. You know what I'm saying? Let's make stories matter. I kind of want to put that on a shirt. Just make stories matter. I do want to, especially as we're closing out here, we just got a very generous tip from Aaron VO, and I wanted to make sure his comment got read while we were live. Let's see. Oh boy, all this login stuff. Aaron VO says, excellent conversation tonight, man. I appreciate it so much. And thank you for being a contributor to the conversation. As always, we appreciate you. And on that, I want to express my appreciation for those of you who joined us tonight. How many few? For those of you who will watch this conversation to the end on VOD and not jump down our throats for what we say at any particular moment, you know, and in place, maybe watching the entire conversation to know that neither of us have any interest in condemning anybody for what they do, but rather to generate dialogue and open up the conversation so that we might not have to condemn people. But make sure you guys go check out my partner over here on his YouTube channel, link in the description below. As he said, he has a Wonder Woman review. Has it come out yet? Have you dropped it yet?
Oh yeah, I just dropped it earlier today. Finally, it's been hard to get out some reviews lately. I've been a little under the weather last week, but it was nice to finally get out and do a review.
Well, you heard it there, folks. Make sure you guys go check out that Wonder Woman review. I know I will be. I will certainly be in the comment section, as should you guys. So make sure you go check it out. If you enjoyed this conversation in any capacity, found it enlightening or whatever, feel free to leave a like down below and subscribe to my channel. And hopefully next week we'll return back to something a little bit more familiar to the viewers of Let's Talk Comics. But again, I want to thank you guys so much for watching, and we will catch you on the next episode.